Hi, this is Chris Urbina. I'm the chair of the SRC. We are going to start in a few minutes. We're waiting for a few members of our team, so just bear with us. We'll be starting in a few minutes. Hi, Joseph. Hi, Rosa. Okay, I think this is going to be us, and if people join us as we start, I'll make sure to embarrass them. Introduce them as they come on. Again, I'm Chris Urbina. I'm the chair of the SRC. I'd like to welcome everybody to this open forum and just remind folks that the meeting is public, and council members are asked to keep their cameras on if they can. The meeting is being recorded, so obviously everything you say is going to be recorded, and for later participation by members in the community, they would want to hear what you have to say. And because it's not an open meeting and there's not a question and answer period, if members of the public would like to make a written comment after you see the slides today, they'll be posted, as well as the minutes will be posted. So feel free, and we do look at your comments and take them very seriously in the SRC. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is do a roll call of the SRC, and then have John do a roll call of the staff that are currently present on the list. So if you could say, when I say your name, could you just say who you represent? Like, for example, Chris Urbina, I'm a public health advocate, a preventive medicine specialist, and I'm representing myself. And I also would like you to comment if you have any changes in your conflict of interest. So I have no conflict of interest changes. If you do, then please submit a conflict of interest form to Kelsey, who is recording and making sure that everybody continues to have conflict of interest forms or declarations after the meeting. So I'd like to start just of the members here on that are currently present. But I'd like to start with Ken and Hurd. Could you introduce yourself and talk about the conflict of interest, please?
Sure, I'm Ken Hurd. I'm an emergency physician and medical toxicologist at the University of Colorado, and I don't have any conflicts of interest.
Thank you, Kenan. Greg Kinney.
I'm a faculty member at Colorado School of Public Health. I'm an epidemiologist, and I have no conflict.
Thank you, Greg. Is Ken Hutchinson on the list yet? Not yet. I'll come back to Kent. Leslie Brooks, is she here? No, it doesn't look like it. How about David Boomba? Nope, not yet. Paula Riggs.
Hi, I have no conflicts, no changes in conflicts, and I'm the director of the Division of Addiction Science Prevention and Treatment in Child, Adolescent, and Addiction Psychiatrist.
Thank you, Paula. Archana Shastra, please.
Hi, I'm Archana Shrestha. I'm an epileptologist at the University of Colorado with particular interest in women's issue and pregnancy, and I have no conflict of interest.
Thank you. Susan Calcaterra. I thought I saw her earlier.
Susan was here.
There she is. Hi, Susan. Introduce yourself and declare if you have any conflict of interest, please. She looks like she's adjusting, and you're on mute, Susan.
I'm sorry, did you ask? My computer just crashed. If I have a conflict of interest?
Yes, introduce yourself, tell us your role on the SRC, and also see if you have any conflicts of interest changes.
Susan Calcaterra. I'm an addiction doctor. I have no conflict of interest, and I'm on the advisory committee.
Thank you. Joseph Schlatt, please.
I'm Joe Schacht. I'm a clinical psychologist, associate professor of psychiatry in the University of Colorado School of Medicine. I have no conflict of interest.
Thank you, Joseph. And first of all, and not last but least, Erica Wymore, please.
Hi, I'm Erica Wymore. I'm a
assistant professor in neonatology at University of Colorado and Children's Hospital of Colorado. And I have no conflicts of interest.
Thank you, everybody. And if somebody joins us from our SRC, we'll be sure to introduce them. John, can I ask you to do a roll call of your staff?
Sure. I'll just go down my screen. I think Bobby is here with us recording and won't be participating. Louis.
I'm Louis Leslie. I'm one of the methodologists working under attending, and Lisa on the review side.
And Louis, you're a little garbled. I don't know if there's something to fix, but because you will be presenting and just.
Is that better?
That's
Yes.
better. Yeah, yeah, that's better. Tianjing.
Hi, Tianjing Li, epidemiologist in the School of Medicine. I'm part of the evidence synthesis team.
Jean-Pierre.
I'm Jean-Pierre Oberste. I'm one of the research methodologists. I'm working under Tianjing.
Okay, and Ashley.
Ashley Brooks Russell, Associate Professor in the School of Public Health, bringing content expertise. And Chris, I want to apologize. I need to switch to my phone at the early part of this meeting, and I'll be responsible for some of those doorbell sounds that will distract the meeting.
Thank you, Zachary, for calling that to my attention.
Okay, Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Barrow, Professor of Medicine and Public Health here at CU Anschutz Medical Campus and on the systematic review team.
Sam?
Hi, Sam Wong. I'm Associate Professor of Pediatrics, Emergency Medicine, Medical Toxicology. I'm also with Ashley as content expert with the group.
And let's see, Kelsey.
Hi, I'm Kelsey Finney. I'm part of the administrative team and I work with John Samet.
And Greg?
Hi, I'm Greg Tung, Associate Professor, School of Public Health, Health Services Researcher, and part of the administrative core for this project.
Okay, great. I think I've gotten everybody. If I've missed someone, please.
Rosa?
Oh, Rosa.
Hi.
Oh, there you are. Okay, sorry.
Rosa Lawrence. I am a professional research assistant on the team.
Okay.
Thanks, John. That was very helpful. I think the audience gets a good feel of our excellent research team, as well as our very diverse and talented SRC. And I just wanted to make sure the public heard that and what a good, awesome group this is. So if you could put up the agenda for me, John, that would be great.
Yeah, let me go ahead with the slides.
And because the screen is only limited in size, if I don't call it or see your hand raised, if you have a question, slip something in the chat so I can pick it up. So that would be great.
Okay, and 1 second. We've done that.
Done that.
Done that.
So let's talk about
Here we are.
Great, thanks everybody. We've already gone through the early remarks, so I think we're already on time. I'd like to just highlight what we're going to try to talk about today. We're going to not go spend any time on the review of the minute meetings or response to SRC recommendations. Those are all posted on the website. I'd like John to talk a little bit about the 13-17 expectations, just to kind of set the framework for us again, because we're getting to the end of our year and our report. Jean-Pierre is going to talk, and Lisa are going to talk about a progress update and study characterization of the studies that they already sent us, and all of you have a chance to look at those. And then Lisa and the team are going to talk about data extraction and those sample studies that you've seen. And finally, I'd like to end the discussion with what's the next steps over the next 5-6 weeks. And we've got a lot of work to do. Everybody's got a lot of work to do, but I wanted to just talk about what the framework is for that going forward. So John, could you talk a little bit about review of the expectations then, please?
Sure. So, I mean, everybody, again, it's a reminder, and I think just a useful reminder every time we are together to say what is in the bill and what do we have to do. So of course, the major initial task is to conduct this systematic review of high-potency THC marijuana. And we've, of course, had multiple conversations about that, established the Scientific Review Council, or SRC, which, of course, has been done, and we're up to our 4th meeting, produced a public education campaign building on what we've learned from the review. And last time we had we had a first conversation about that. We won't be returning to that topic today. So here is the in more detail what we are to do. And again, this review is in progress, and we will give you an update on the progress. As you know, it's turned out to be a massive project given the scope of the literature and its diversity and some of the challenges, in the sense trying to wrangle it into an understandable database, identify needed research, talk about what gaps there are, which we're certainly emerging, including what might be needed to address gaps in the literature. And I think some of those gaps are becoming all too evident. This first report due July 1st, 2022, potentially conduct additional research. And I think we know already that there will be additional research to be done on the database that is in development, and then of course conduct this research independently. I will say not up here, and I think we probably should return to it at the end, is the task for the SRC, which include commenting on the review and providing the SRC's own recommendations. And I think perhaps at the end, Chris, when we come back to that session at 3:30, I'll pull up the bill so that we can go through the relevant pieces of it. And I think that's it in terms of this reminder.
Yeah, thanks, John. I was hoping that we can get back to that final thing when we talk about our final session. I kind of highlighted the things, the charges to the SRC, so we can talk about those again. I think it's a good reminder.
Yeah, actually, let me just ask Kelsey, if you have a moment, there's some slides that we should have in hand from the bill, I think, with these materials highlighted between yourself or Greg. I think you know the portions of the bill. If we just get those on a slide so we can show those.
Thanks. All right, so are we ready for Lisa to talk a little bit about the progress update and study characteristics? And Jean-Pierre? Okay, so
yeah, you could just skip over those two, because I think those are the ones that I was talking about. Yeah, yep. So we'll get to this. So just to introduce this topic, we'll show you where we are with our review. So here on the flow chart, you'll see our search, and I want you to focus on that box that's down at the left side, because it shows we have 753 studies included in our review. And what we're really focusing on today and in our data extraction going forward is 489 primary research studies that are observational in nature or randomized controlled trials. We also have identified 264 systematic reviews or case reports or case series, and those are on a lower priority for data extraction. So what we're going to show you next is we have captured the characteristics of the 489 included studies, and we did send you that table in advance if you want to look at the detail. But now Jean-Pierre is just going to go over the highlights from that table. Jean-Pierre?
Yeah, so very briefly, this is your author affiliation by type. So sort of how the authors are affiliated. The vast majority of the studies, as we're seeing, are academic. Next slide, please, John. Here we have conflicts of interest in study funding by type. Once again, vast majority of these are government, but I think we should also sort of draw attention to the not reported. There's a very large number of studies who both don't report conflicts of interest and they don't report study funding. So it's something we'll definitely want to look at in the future. Next slide, please. Here we have the design and objectives. So really this is sort of harm versus benefits, and some studies, of course, study both. Once again, the vast majority of our data is going to be found in the observational studies. And in that, actually, we have really a lot of harm and safety studies. So we're going to have a lot of unintentional poisoning, sort of things like that, where we're observing data of the harms of cannabis. The next slide. Here we have restrictions and eligibility criteria. So this is, they were required to be eligible required to have a certain condition to be eligible for the actual study. We have a large chunk of healthy or general population, but we also have sort of a large number of pain, neurologic, and oncologic. So we're seeing a lot of studies in that sort of field. The other, we're sort of going to be going through further in further data extraction. Next slide. Here is sort of the table itself with locations included sort of by country. Most of them are going to be in the US, although we do have a few in the UK, Canada, and Israel, and sort of others scattered across the world. Next slide. And here we are, sort of the concentration in the lower 48 states. Unsurprisingly, we have a lot in California, we have a lot in Colorado, we have a lot in New York. So places with fairly large populations that have already legalized cannabis are having a lot of studies, but we kind of have studies scattered all over. And then next slide. Here's the actual table that shows the studies by state all across. There's a few weird ones here with American Samoa and Northern Mariana Islands. We've actually already identified the study where this comes from. It's an error. It's probably not going to show up in the next data extraction. So next slide, please. Finally, we have our indicators of health equity. It's pretty grim here. The vast majority do not have any sort of analysis of health equity. And even many studies that might stratify subgroups, that actually don't have any analysis after. So they'll just sort of give a table on stratification. And then next slide, we see that that's not really changed in the US specifically either. So it's not really a difference between the US and in other countries. It's pretty consistent that no one is doing a lot of research on health equity in relation to cannabis. And the next slide. So here we have demographics. Everything here is fairly consistent. One thing to point out though is race and ethnicity are going to be conflated in some studies. So this is the overall inclusion. And if you go to the next slide, we have the US studies. But as I said, there's going to be some conflation. So a lot of the US studies actually separate race and ethnicity, whereas a lot of the other studies will actually conflate them. So they'll all be sort of jammed into a single box. Some others here will also sort of be filtered out during further data extraction. And then next slide. Finally, we have age and developmental stage of study population. So looking at this, the vast majority are adults. Although you'll also notice we do have child 1 through 8 and birth to less than 1 year of age. Most of these are going to be observational studies that are like unintentional poisoning. So it'll be chart reviews of unintentional marijuana poisonings at a hospital, for example. We do have some others here. Those are also likely to get filtered out during further data extraction. And I think that's the last slide there.
Lisa and Jean-Pierre, can I ask a question here? Of all the studies, I wasn't able to count the number, and you may have said this initially, that all of that the extraction characteristics is of how many studies?
That will be a 489 of the ones who are just observationals or RCTs, no case reports or systematic reviews.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, that's our whole sample.
Great.
Any other
right.
questions on that?
Thank you. I was going to ask that. Anybody have a question about that? Thank you, Lisa.
And maybe just a quick comment. I mean, these studies are, that work of extracting the study characteristics is complete. And so we have all that information captured for all the studies. And we go on to talk about data extraction, the actual results. That's the work that's in progress and where we're going to talk about the issues involved.
Thank you for clarifying that, John. Joseph, you had a question.
I just had a quick question about the location that were indicated for the studies. Is that the location that the study patients or participants were in, or the location of the authors of the study?
Correct. It's location of participants.
Thanks.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, and just one small comment about we do have some, other categories or and those may change slightly as we dig into each individual study, but we don't expect anything too dramatic. And this is the complete sample, as John said.
Thank you. Any other questions from the SRC?
I was wondering if you could go back to the slide. I think it was the medical comorbidity slide.
Oh, the one on participant, I know what I mean. The restrictions on selection.
Yeah. Can you talk
sorry.
that one? Can you remind, I'm not remembering, these were the categories that we were examining. Like these are the outcomes related to cannabis use.
No, these aren't the outcomes. These are the entry criteria. So for example, someone might have enrolled a healthy population, or someone might have enrolled people with a certain psychiatric disorder. And so these are the population characteristics.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
But you can still see that there's still a significant, maybe it looks like 1/5 of are other, and nearly a third are other or not reported. So big chunk. Any other questions from the SRC? Great. Thanks, Jean-Pierre. Thanks for a quick review.
Great. So just stay here a second, John, because I want to introduce this topic. So what we're going to show you here is data extraction for the 14 studies that we've fully completed so far. So what that means is that each study has been independently had the data extracted by 2 coders. They resolved any discrepancies by consensus, or if they couldn't be resolved, we had a third coder come in and resolve the discrepancies. So these 14 we're going to show you are complete. They include those 9 that were sent to the SRC. We sent you those 9 because we were hoping to give you an idea of the challenges we're facing with the data extraction and what we're getting out of it. And, this is really, as John said, the meat of the data. So we're trying to get here, what are the actual exposures and what are the outcomes that are being measured. And in that process, and this is very usual in systematic review, once you dig into the full text and the data of a paper, you may find that it doesn't actually look like it meets your inclusion criteria, or another issue comes up. And so we're going to show you some the data extraction of those questions that we can get from the evidence map. But then we have 2 areas we'd like you to consider, which are related to some of the difficulties we're having on extracting potency that Lewis is going to go over, and then an area of where we're finding outcomes that may be relevant, but they aren't outcomes we had pre-specified in our protocol, and Sam's going to go over that. So now we can go to the next. Oh, and I should say one other thing about the data extraction. It takes about 3 hours per paper for that dual data extraction. So that will get quicker among experienced coders, but as we go out to a wider group of coders that may be less experienced, that time may not go down. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Lisa, can you clarify these 14 studies that you did this data extraction? This is the cream of the group, right? This is the
well, yes. We started out by trying to find the studies just on the surface that looked like they had the most complete data on potency of product, because of course that's what we're looking for, and that had outcomes that met our criteria. So that's the studies we've started out with. So these 14 we think are some of our best examples. That's not to say that we may not find a study later that is a really great study, but given the preliminary data we've collected, these look like our best guess.
And Chris, I just want to point out, David has joined.
Hi, David. Can you introduce yourself, tell us your role on the committee, please, and see if you have any changes in your conflict of interest, please?
Yeah, Chris, David Brumbaugh. I'm a Chief Medical Officer at Children's Hospital, Colorado, Associate Professor of Pediatrics. No change in my conflicts.
Great. Thank you, David, for joining us and for introducing yourself. Thank you, John.
Yep. So Lisa, do you want me to go on?
Yep, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so one of the questions that we can interrogate our evidence map with is this one. So of the different types of cannabis products studied, how many have reported potency, frequency, and or duration of use? And so this is our 14 studies here. And what you'll see is, a study can look at multiple products, or a study may report both potency and frequency, for example. So that's why these numbers are greater than 14. But what you'll see here just among this sample is on the far left side, most of the studies that are reporting on potency are looking at just generic cannabis products, although we do about halfway down the graph there have a number of studies that are of concentrates that are also reporting potency. And the reason we're collecting data on frequency and duration is because even in the absence of potency, that can tell us something about exposure that might be useful to the SRC. So next one shows us the types of outcomes that have been examined for studies that reported potency. So these are only the ones that are reporting on potency. And again, studies can report multiple outcomes. So we actually have 69 outcomes shown here that are reported over the 14 studies. And also what we're showing here are outcome domains. And so under mental health, there can be many different outcomes. There can be schizophrenia, there can be depression, and these can be measured in different ways. So these are the general domains, which we may or may not be able to synthesize all the time, depending on how heterogeneous they are within the domain. And again, just among these preliminary 14 studies, we see that most of the outcomes that have been measured are in mental health, but we also have this other clump through the neurological and respiratory so far. So that's what we're getting so far.
And Lisa, I don't mean to dominate the questions, but these are lumped together, both health as well as adverse effects?
Correct.
You don't make
Yes.
a judgment.
Yes.
It's categorized.
So again, we could interrogate, the evidence map has that coding. And so we can actually say of the outcomes that are mental health, how many of them were adverse or beneficial, or how many of the studies, we're looking at adverse and or beneficial outcomes. As you may recall, we didn't actually label each individual outcome as adverse or beneficial because that depends on the context sometime.
Sure. Thank you. Any other questions so far of these very complex slides here? Okay, thanks, Lisa.
Great. So the next one just breaks it down a little bit more for us, and we can ask, of all the studies so we've extracted, what types of outcomes have been studied for the different types of cannabis products. And this is getting really interesting here, and I think will be, when we have more data, very useful for the SRC because it points out some gaps. And so you'll see that for the outcome of cancer there at the beginning, we don't have any resin products studied, for example. That's the bright green, but we do have resin products studied for cardiometabolic, gastrointestinal, et cetera. So this really shows you which products have been studied under which outcome domains. And so if we see a cluster of studies looking at a particular high potency product in a certain domain, again, we could potentially group those for some sort of synthesis. There's a lot on this slide, so I can pause a second if there's any questions. Okay, this is a really important slide to us because as you may recall, for each study that reports a potency, and they report them in different units, so that's a complication, as I'm sure you've seen from the papers, but we extract what are the highest potency levels reported in the paper and what are the lowest potency levels. And so what this graph shows you here is for two ways of measuring potency, percent THC or milligrams THC, what are the highest potency levels that are reported. So in the graph on the left, the black line shows you the median percent THC level that is reported in studies that report that potency. And so that's about 25 or so. And then you'll see those dots at the top show us some outliers from that median. So we've got up to 85% THC reported in one of the studies. And those tend to be the studies of concentrates, those outliers. And then on the right, we have many fewer studies that are reporting milligrams THC, and these are the edibles, and you can see the median is at 50 milligrams of THC.
Could I ask a question, Lisa?
Go ahead, Paula.
About that. So one of the papers talked about the kind of a potency valley in the middle, suggesting it's bimodal. I mean, the potency of smoked cannabis or, a flower or whatever in the range of 20 or whatever percent, and then concentrates much higher, but not necessarily much in the middle. I mean, really high or in the flower range. And how is that captured in our the lit review and the data extraction?
Yeah, that is a great question, because again, what we've been capturing are the reported values for the highest and the lowest in a study. So we wouldn't capture something like a valley. But what's even more complicating there is sometimes those potency levels aren't actually associated with any outcome. So although they may report potency for their population or for the products used by their population, then they put that all into aggregate and report it for their in association with their outcome. So that's the kind of study where we would have to actually, if we were interested in that outcome and thought that study had interesting data, we'd have to actually try to go back and get the individual data from that study. So did that answer your question?
Well, yes, I mean, so there's the range of potencies within a study, and then there's also the range of potencies across studies. And I'm kind of guessing that they may be clumped into the high, and then kind of this media high, but not much in the 50% or 40% THC range. I mean, that there may be perhaps a bimodal or some kind of distribution across studies themselves of potencies, really high and lower.
Right. So we're capturing, as I mentioned, the highest reported in a study and the lowest reported in a study. So we're not capturing every individual data point reported in a study, but that would at least give us a range. So we do, I'm not showing the lowest here because we have less data for that with these 14, but this is just the high end.
Thank you.
Joseph, you had a question or comment.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Lisa, I was curious, I think you said that the studies depicted on the right-hand side here by weight of THC were all edible products. Is that true so far in all of the studies you've reviewed, that if they report a weight, it's an edible product?
I don't know if that's true for all. Louis or Jean-Pierre, anybody want to comment on that?
No, it's not always true.
Yeah. Okay. It would be nice if it were true, just because it would give you a different way of categorizing. And I did want to clarify, we are coding somewhere in here the route of administration as well. So vaporized versus smoke versus edible, that kind of thing.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
We even had to add a new route of administration when we started extracting data. We had a long list of potential routes.
Sure.
I can't remember what it was now, but.
I think that will be valuable to look at some point, in particular, because with edible, you might suspect that the entire dose was ingested, that, if someone's taking a gummy or something like that, it's pretty difficult to titrate that. So they probably took the whole thing, versus some of these things where if they're inhaled, you really have no idea how much of the thing they actually ingested.
Greg, you had a question or comment?
I was going to make the same point that Joseph was making, that it might not even be possible to convert everything into milligrams, even if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Great
and I
comment.
think, well, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, great comments and discussion. This is useful. Lisa, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. And I think when we get to those potency issues, it'll really highlight some of this difficulty. Okay, next one, John. So again, we can just, interrogate the evidence map to answer this type of question: what potencies have been studied by outcome? We could do this, for example, for routes of administration by product by outcome. So we can also do 3-level analyses. With only 14 studies, we didn't bother to do that. But again, this just gives you an idea that you can, looking at this, you can see, well, some outcomes have been studied at sort of the higher percent levels of THC, and some have been studied at the lower percent THC levels. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Louis, because as I said, which is common in systematic review, when you really dig into a paper, and all of these were included because we thought from the abstract and title screening they had information on potency, but when you dig into them, that's not always the case. So Louis, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, next slide. So as Lisa was saying, our initial criteria for the review was we wanted a reported potency. So some sort of units and some sort of numeric. If we didn't have that, we would include a study if we could infer from the reporting, if it was something like butane hash oil, we could infer that this is likely a concentrate, even if there isn't a reported potency. The problem we're running into is that it's unclear or cannot be determined with some of these participants in these studies, and we're proposing to exclude these. So we're going to go through a few examples, and then at the end, we'll hear what you think. So next. All right, so this study is a randomized trial in participants with fibromyalgia. This cannabis extract initially actually seemed fairly high potency when we were looking at the inclusion. But when we started to dive into this for data extraction, the actual dose was quite small. And on the high end, it was the 4.4 milligrams of THC per day. So the predominance of this is it was also selected by participants. So it was hard to know what the actual ascribed dose was. Next. In this study, we have high dose CBD, which is used in this population. And unfortunately for these, the majority would use primarily CBD-based products, and each individual could use multiple types. The mandate for high potency, for these, it would be hard to tell because they're saying the high dose is greater than 5% THC oil, and we don't have metrics above that. And so that requires some inference that we're unsure about. Next. So for this particular study, we actually have some sort of description of what participants are using, either smoked, inhaled, oil combined. And we have a subset of those where we've looked at the actual THC breakdown, and we have the thresholds of 10% and less than 10% and the CBD. Again, we're not actually sure about the intake reported either by month, and it's not correlated with the potency directly. This study was at a single dispensary. What they did with this was to hand out a questionnaire with a number of tools to look at these outcomes. They gathered self-reported different potencies, different preferences for these concentrations. And then the day before, what they did was actually to go into the dispensary and look at some of these products and then come up with the potency by THC percentage or and the CBD. And then we kind of have to take that 2 steps to actually assume that maybe these things are connected, but we don't actually know the intake. For this study, we actually don't have any intake described. This is car accidents in France. And for that, we would only have the serum levels for thresholds.
Can you go back to that slide, Louis? I didn't get a chance to look at that very carefully. So these are people that died and not died, and the results of the screening was positive THC with no potency information.
Correct. So they would do an initial urine or swab, oral swab, and then they would do blood. And so we don't have any information on intake.
Thank you. Any questions of the slides that you want further clarification from Louis? Okay, keep going.
Well, can I just say, or just ask, actually, Chris, excuse me, if, we're trying to think as we extract data, how is this going to be useful to the SRC in the, recommendations they need to make? And so, as Louis said, we're proposing to exclude these studies, which after we look at them, we realize we really can't get anything on potency out of them. So I just want to make sure, because we don't think that's, that would be useful. So I just want to make sure that everybody's clear on that, and if there are any comments on that.
So let's see if I understand the question. So here we have a sample of the 14 studies of the challenges associated with potency and as well as concentrations. And so we're not, even though we thought they were going to be helpful, they may not be helpful at all in terms of describing, linking the potency with the outcome. Is that what I hear?
Well, they're not even helpful in terms of reporting data on potency that we could maybe later link with the outcome. So, it's just a matter of priority in terms of, extracting data from these. We want to focus on what's most useful. And, we never know. I can't tell you how many studies like this there are, because you really have to get into each study to know if there's useful data on potency. But yeah, I guess we'd like to go ahead to say, let's just exclude them for now. They would still be in our pool if we did want to go look at them for any reason later, but we wouldn't do the full data extraction.
Great. So then the question for the SRC is this: do we support? I mean, do we think we ought to go in this direction, exclude studies like this that they've described in our analysis? Thoughts from folks?
Actually, can I interrupt for a sec? The fire alarm is going off in my building. Can somebody else take over slides for the moment while
I can do that if you stop sharing before you rush out.
Okay, all right. I will be back. Hopefully this is nothing, but there's construction that keeps setting this off. I'll be back.
Okay.
Hey, Lisa, I have a question.
Yep.
It might be helpful if anybody here knows off the top of your head, like an example of a publication that did it really well. Because it's hard to know, like, it's a little, I don't know that the one about the fatalities and the car accidents, like clearly that would need to be thrown out. But what if the majority of the papers are like maybe the first two that were presented, and then what do we do? So I'm just curious, were there some papers that stick out in your mind that they really fit nicely into this bucket that we're asking you to categorize potency and into?
Yeah, I think of those 9 that you all looked at and the 14 we've extracted, they definitely got data we want and that we can use. I would say that, and Louis, I'm sure you can think of examples off the top of your head, or Jean-Pierre or Rosa, but the real sticking point is they don't all actually calculate in their paper an association between the potency data and the outcome, but we're still including those because, potentially that's data we could get to do that sort of analysis ourselves. So I do think we've gotten, in that first pool of 14, we've gotten some, although I would say that none are perfect so far.
And I think in the set of 9 that we sent out, a couple would probably be the prints, the 2019 prints, and then the Cutler 2021. I think those ones have pretty clear associations, but definitely more of the exception rule.
Great questions. Greg, you had a comment.
Can I also respond to that question? I think last time I showed like a randomized control trial where, you can clearly link the exposure level to the outcomes, but unfortunately, most of the studies are observational in nature. And what's more frustrating is when you look at the association, they're all reported in very different ways among the very few studies which actually gave you association, right? It could be a correlation coefficient, could be an odds ratio, could be a regression coefficient. And then the exposure and outcome, again, they're all measured in very diverse and heterogeneous way. So, by the end of the day, when you think about how to synthesize these, we may have to do a lot of qualitative narrative synthesis just by pointing out the direction of dissociation rather than quantitatively analyzing the strength of association.
That's a very good point, Tanjin, because I think we're already getting the message loud and clear that there isn't all of these studies so far don't fit into the box that we'd like them to fit into.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have to do some sort of qualitative analysis rather than quantitative.
The other point I want to add to that is of those 408, 400 some studies, they're all included in our evidence maps. But again, very few of those actually have association for us to look at. We really try to give you good examples amongst those 9 we send out. But again, as you can see, they're not a perfect study. So that's what we're struggling with, and that will be, something we need to talk about, how from there to come up with the recommendations, from a very heterogeneous evidence base to come up with some recommendations.
Right.
Part of what Greg, you had a question or comment.
Yeah, part of what I thought we were doing here was identifying holes in the data, and it feels like if we start off with 489 studies And then you can show us a grid of the elements that are required for perfect extraction versus other kinds, other levels of perfect extraction. At least then we can look at the ones that have to be excluded at the point that you already have the paper in hand. And it would be really nice if we not only know what failed that paper, like the one that Lisa was talking about, where the driving study, you actually can't get at the data, though they were reporting on something interesting. If we have the target of the research as well, because that will help us understand which types of studies are needed in which areas, and which studies failed to do it to the extent that would let us combine them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So that's exactly what the evidence map is getting at. So that map has all of the elements of the data extraction that, we would look for in the ideal study. And what we're going to find is that some of those are going to be blank. And we'll be able to drill down and say, for which studies are there, do we have those elements or not?
Thank you. Go ahead, Paula.
Yeah, this is a really important point, because what Susan's pointing to too is the state of the science is different in different areas. And what would we lose by getting rid of some of these less rigorous ones? Well, the state of the science, asking questions around prenatal exposure or breast milk or whatever, is at a more primitive level than maybe looking at PTSD and vets or something like that. And so what would we lose? But you're saying that we'll capture all of that. There will be a way to get at qualitatively, because one of the gaps will be the state of the science itself. It's, of the various studies and recommendations around how we perhaps going forward research could proceed in a more standardized way of capturing things.
Yeah, you will get that information, but the only thing we're proposing not to include here is the ones where, after we look closely, we think they have no information on potency. And another reason to exclude those is, remember, that was one of our initial inclusion criteria. So there's a whole bunch of studies out there we've already excluded because it was obvious they had no data on potency. So it's kind of unfair to then later include some, when they don't really have what we're looking for either.
So I think that sounds reasonable. I guess I'd like a show of hands. Does this seem like a reasonable proposal to of this 489 studies, that if they don't have any information on potency or that we go ahead and exclude those, capture the information and still keep up with Greg's idea, is that we still report this is the absence of information here. And I think that's important to point out, but at least for this first extraction, exclude those. Does that make sense? Show of hands if that sounds reasonable. Anybody opposed to that? No, I think you got a consensus there, Lisa.
Great. Let me see if I can share my screen. John still isn't. Are you guys seeing questions and discussion?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. I'm not on my usual computer. I'm actually at work. Okay, so now we'll move on to actually a more complicated issue. So thank you a lot for that decision. And Sam is going to go over the next slide if I can advance it.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lisa. So I just wanted to briefly talk about something else that's come up during our literature review. It pertains to outcomes other than our designated health outcomes. And so these outcomes are not specified by our initial protocol that we all got your input in and discussed and finalized. And these other studies' effects may still have relevance for public health. These can include psychomotor performance, memory, binocular depth, motor control, response time, neurocognitive impairment. These are just some examples of some of these kind of quote unquote non-designated health outcomes from what we designated as that we are seeing in our literature review. We're proposing that we include these in the evidence map, but they have lower priority for data extraction currently. And then we can come back to these later down the road as time permits and kind of how the group feels they want to prioritize these outcomes. We've kind of thrown around some how do we group these outcomes? We've talked about calling them mechanistic outcomes, psychomotor effects, or neurocognitive functioning effects. But these, again, are not kind of defined by the primary health outcomes that we initially decided as a group with your help.
So I have two questions regarding your presentation, Sam. One is, these sound like adverse effects as opposed to intended health benefits, one. And then two, is this a very common reported finding in the studies you reviewed so far, or are these infrequent in terms of the reporting?
That's a good question. I don't know about the frequency of these are coming up. Does Lisa, Louis, Jean-Pierre, Rosa, do you guys have any input on that?
I think these are fairly frequent,
Yeah.
actually. Sometimes it's a mix of these and our traditional ones, but yeah, these are actually pretty common.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, Chris, as far as like your comment about adverse outcomes, you know, many of these studies look at the impact, not necessarily determining if they're adverse or not. So they could have impair your memory or slow your motor control. But I think how you interpret that subjective change can be the eye of the beholder. And then how that change impacts, you know, potentially other outcomes like, does response time and motor control impact your driving ability? You know, I think that's where kind of these kind of potentially add up or impact or have I'm not trying to say, how does it show impairment if you were using high potency cannabis? But yeah, so that hopefully that answers your question.
I think it does. Yeah, Joseph, you had a comment or a question.
Yeah, I feel that these are important outcomes to include. One thing that I would consider is that these strike me as outcomes that likely would have been assessed in a laboratory. And that suggests to me that likely they come from studies in which perhaps RCT-like studies where the product was administered in the laboratory as well. And that to me is very high quality evidence, because now you know exactly what someone was exposed to. And I would hate to lose that, even if these represent kind of broader domains of function that don't map neatly to a specific health outcome. I think they could be high quality studies.
Yeah, no, Joseph, I don't think we disagree. I think some of these are actually quite well done. They may have associated with certain scores that may be measuring, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. We reviewed some of these studies where they were using specific scores, and how do you interpret the score and how it illustrates a specific health outcome, I think it can still be a little difficult. And we're not saying these aren't important. I think these are some of the ways you can objectively measure the impact of using high potency and other cannabis products. And so we do want to keep them on the evidence map, and we will be keeping these studies. But I think from the kind of the first sweep, based on our determination of what we define as health outcomes, they were going to have lower priority for the data extraction first go around. But then as we kind of go down the road of this project, potentially revisit these types of studies.
Erica, I saw your hand go up and then you took it down.
Yes, I'm okay. You answered it in some of the conversations, so I'm all good.
Archana.
So it sounds like in terms of, how things were measured, they could be non-specific, just kind of self-reported, or it could be actual testing that got done with some numbers to go with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that both of those types of outcomes were included in these types of studies. So yes.
Greg, and then Ashley.
Sam, will you be able, for specifically memory, will you be able to see whether it's measured memory as a negative or as a positive? For instance, if you're measuring a lack of memory of the PTSD event versus a memory that you actually would like to have kept.
You mean how we're capturing the data?
No, are we going to be able to extract that for instance, specifically memory was being captured for a positive or negative outcome?
Research team, are we looking at that at all?
I don't think we're extracting at that level of detail at this stage.
We might look, sorry, I'm back.
Yeah.
And building to not burn down construction workers. But there's, I mean, an example would be in the studies that were sent out. There's one that looks at false memories, recall, and there's actually some others on cognitive functioning. So there could be, I think, the outcomes described could capture that, Greg. I think it depends on how they're there. And then, of course, they would have to be interpreted and as you suggest, sort of as viewed as a beneficial or non-beneficial in terms of the consequence.
Yeah, and we do capture some like basic information on the measure, but I mean, one thing we're seeing in these studies, there's like a million different ways of measuring, even the same outcome. And so we're not actually extracting that text. But again, that's where the evidence map helps us, because say we get, a nexus of studies that actually have information on potency that are looking at some memory domain, then we could dig into them. And, so we'd have to actually go back to get that kind of detailed information.
Great. Ashley, I saw your hand up briefly. Did you have
Yeah, and my comment's pretty directly related to the last couple of comments. To help kind of illustrate what this might be like, this measure of memory, it may be ability to recall something, the speed to recall something, or a measure of reaction time. And I would agree that these are likely to be experimental data, and so are likely to be high quality. But what's missing is like a gold standard of what a score means. It's comparing this group to that group, but without sometimes, not to overgeneralize because I don't know every possible study well, but without being able to say what is poor or what is good, and that's the piece, the missing piece linking it to a meaningful health outcome. It's kind of an absence of context.
Good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Joseph, you had another question or comment?
Yeah, actually directly related to Ashley's comment, and this may be too much to hope for, but I'll reveal my bias as a psychologist here as well. Some of these may be outcomes that actually were performed with very well psychometrically normed scales. Again, those are valuable. Again, it's perhaps too much to hope from that multiple authors use the same scale, but that would be very valuable if you had the same specific measure in more than one study. And if it's a normed scale, then you can in fact interpret positive or negative, because you can interpret a group mean relative to a norm on that measure.
If I could add to what Joe's saying, I agree. If it's a human lab experiment, they use psychometrically valid measures, and oftentimes the scores are kind of normed also in what's a clinical cutoff, what's a clinically meaningful cutoff that really is relevant to clinical impairment or clinical benefit or whatever. So I do think many of those studies are likely to have very psychometrically valid measures, and ones that could be also benchmarked to other standard measures in the field as well. So, I mean, it's not likely they would just pull one out of the stratosphere and just use one DIY that they made up themselves because they wanted to get it if it was published in a peer-reviewed journal.
So Sam, back to you. What's the question on the table that you want the decision recommendation from the SRC?
I think, I guess it sounds like the SRC is questioning whether we should look at some of these specific outcomes and include them in the initial data extraction based on potentially the specific measures they're looking at, and if they're proven to have benefit or fall into a bucket of the primary health outcomes we have set out. I don't know if John, Tanjing, and Lisa have any thoughts on kind of the conversation that's going on and how we want to move forward with this.
Well, it's all a matter of prioritizing at those 3 hours a paper data extraction. So, I think we really would have to actually collect more data, for example, to look at things like the measure and was it a validated measure and things like that. So, I think just sort of finding out what buckets we have of, information that might reach a critical mass where we could address a question seems the most efficient way to go. And we're not going to lose these outcomes. And it's also important, when we're doing the data extraction, one reason it takes so long is you have to actually, you have to sometimes extract data by outcome. So like for the different outcomes, they're not actually even doing the study the same way or doing the exposure the same way or doing the measure. So if you've got 9 outcomes in a paper that can be grouped, great. But if you've got 4 that can't be grouped, then you also have to extract all the associated data, if that makes sense.
I'll make a couple comments. I mean, I think, and Lisa, you can weigh back in. I mean, I think we're not going to lose which studies are which. And I think the question would be, and if you look at some of the tables that have extensive scores from different scales, you can see there would be an enormous job to extract them. That said, if we could identify 3 or 4 that use the same instruments to measure outcomes and either see if we could group them, or in the case of really doing a lot of work, go back to the authors and see if we can get hold of the original data so that it could be, grouped in the comparable fashion and pooled and analyzed to try and gain power. We could do such things. So, I mean, I think that's where the value of the evidence map approach really could be useful if there are studies there that we can agree would be potentially informative. But at least you may, or Tianjing, perhaps comment further on that possibility.
I think the third bullet on this slide is probably what we're going to do is basically coding these different outcomes by a slightly bigger bucket so that we can map them out and then have the potential to go back and look at them. I think at least at this stage of data extraction, we're certainly not extracting which instrument was used to measure memory, for example. But we're hearing from the SRC, and we're definitely taking note of that, and we can code them at this stage and then come back to it.
Yeah, that was nicely said, Tianjing. I think that's what I hear. People said, keep them, record them, and a future assessment, we can dive deeper into those that may be comparable or not. So does that seem like a reasonable consensus from everybody?
I think so.
Okay, kind of a random show of hands here. Yep, looks like that's people saying yes. Anybody opposed to that approach? Okay, you got it. Is that what you need, Sam? Oh,
I'll stop sharing, John, if you want to take over
sounds
the
great.
slides again.
Thank you.
Let me see where we are.
So
You want to keep at it, Lisa? Maybe easier if you just
keep at it. Fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Paula, your hand's still up. Did you have a question or comment?
No, sorry, I meant to lower it. Thanks.
Okay, no problem. No problem. All right. So this is where some of the rubber is still. I mean, the research group has done an excellent job. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness, the questions, the asking for input on the extraction, the evidence maps. I mean, everything has been quite terrific from my perspective, and I hope the SRC is in the same in agreement with that. So now I'd like to maybe John and I can talk a little bit about where we're going to go over the next 5 weeks.
Yeah. And Chris, let me see if Greg, did you pull out the SRC charge out of the bill by any chance?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead,
Oh.
Greg. I sent you an
Okay.
email with it as well, but Greg might have it up.
Yeah, I've pulled it up. I've pulled it up already.
And maybe
so.
Lisa, if you could stop sharing, it might be good now to go back to that.
All right, that's my cue to share. Yeah, John.
Yes, please share.
Okay.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
If you remember, almost 6-7 months ago, we reviewed this legislation and we talked about the role of the SRC as an independent group different than the research group and what our roles were. So, Greg, if you could walk through the pieces of the language that talks about the role of the SRC, that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. And I'm happy to dive into any detail and go into the interpretation of the language. Like I'll spoil the surprise though, and I'll just summarize it in my mind overall and just say that the SRC has a kind of an oversight and advisory function. I think it's very much in line with the interactions that we've had and oversight of the work and advising the work that the School of Public Health is doing, and that the School of Public Health is responsible for giving regular updates and actually submitting drafts of all required reports, including a report that's coming up here July 1. And independent of the School of Public Health, it's our interpretation that the SRC is responsible for generating recommendations to the General Assembly. That's after reviewing the work and the draft report of the School of Public Health. And we at the School of Public Health are also responsible for generating recommendations. So there's that kind of interesting dynamic and interplay of recommendations that are put forward by the School of Public Health, and then what the SRC concludes and recommends as well.
So I looked for that language, Greg, and I could not see where the SRC had an independent report. I only read where the School of Public Health and the research team were responsible for the reports themselves, that they would share with the SRC and we would review and look at them. In addition, the educational campaign was also, that was clearly listed separately, that said we would review and approve the educational campaign. Yeah, and so the section that I think is relevant here is what I've got highlighted. Hopefully I'm sharing the correct stuff and you guys can see. You know, you're never supposed to read off of slides, but maybe I'll violate that rule here and I'll just say, so the Colorado School of Public Health, this is section B, which really outlines what the SRC is, how it's formulated, all of this, but we'll focus on this particular section. So this Colorado School of Public Health shall establish a scientific review council to review the initial report and any subsequent reports produced pursuant to subsection 2A. So 2A outlines all of the review functions and everything that the School of Public Health is supposed to do. 2A of the section and here's the independent recommendations piece, and make recommendations to the General Assembly regarding appropriate evidence-based regulatory changes and the funding of additional necessary evidence-based research. So in 2A, and I don't have that section pulled up, but I'll just say in 2A, where the detailed elements of what the Colorado School of Public Health is responsible for, it says that we need to be generating recommendations. That actually goes into the draft report that the SRC reviews. You look at those and then the SRC generates their own. I'm interested, you know, maybe I'm going a little bit too far here, but I'll indulge me for just 10 seconds. I'm just interested to see what happens, because I think what could happen is you could review our draft recommendations, agree with them, and there might be alignment. There also might be a scenario where we feel like the evidence base is at a certain point where it's a combination, some combination of policy recommendations and research recommendations in particular gaps. And there might be a slight different interpretation that the SRC has. I'll stop there. No, I think that's very helpful. And so I think I'd like some response from the.
Actually, Chris, Greg, I think if you go further, there's the, about the timing of the report. I think there's some additional relevant language there, if I'm remembering correctly. So if you keep going till we get to the report. So now keep going.
No, I think it's up higher, John.
Maybe it's here. Yeah.
Greg, it's on page 2 under subsection 2A. At the bottom of page 2.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this is the other relevant language. So if you go up to the top of that, I'm sorry, go back up.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, stop there.
Okay.
So here, so I think if everybody could look at that and then keep going.
Going up, John?
Down.
Down, gotcha.
And stop here. Oh.
And if my memory is correct, I can try to summarize all of this dense text really quick.
Okay.
If that's useful. I won't do it until somebody requests it.
So I see, as I read this piece, Greg and John, I read this as it's more a responsibility of School of Public Health to submit the reports and the legislative body, and less independent responsibility by the SRC.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then it also puts forward, I think, some standards, and it gives us some deadlines and particular dates of when reports are due. But then it also gives us a chart to say, if we reach a point where we feel like our synthesis of the evidence leads us to believe that it's justification for particular regulations or policies, that we would then deliver them at that time as well. So it's not simply those particular dates. And I think this section also highlights and outlines further the relationship between the School of Public Health and the SRC, and that we're going to be delivering these draft reports, which include, in the end, recommendations that the School of Public Health has, either in terms of additional research that's necessary or policy that might be supported by the systematic review. And that the SRC has that kind of review function, but then makes their own independent recommendations based off of that.
And it may be, and we'll talk about this, it may be that we agree and we say our recommendations are to accept what the School of Public Health does. And so that's where we are. And I appreciate Greg and John reviewing this legislative language with us, because it's a little technical. I agree. So
yeah, it is. It is.
All right. So let's pull back and let's jump back into the discussion. Are there any questions from Greg or John about the legislative intent? Okay. So if you remember, about 3 weeks ago, I had this harebrained idea. Obviously, I didn't have much hair to add to it, but I had this harebrained idea to come up with these subgroups. And I thought it was reasonable that we could, outside of this larger open forum with a very tight agenda and some reports, that we could start to do some subgroup discussions about what the materials that we've gotten so far, the preliminary extractions, the evidence maps, all of the materials that the research team has shared with us, to start to do a deeper dive and some of the discussion around not only the recommendations we might put forward as an SRC, as well as start to discuss some of the data gaps and research gaps that we've already heard about. So that was really the hope of the subgroups. And obviously we couldn't get off that ground because we still didn't have enough information yet ready to actually discuss. So now we're at that point. I do think that, and I arbitrarily made the decision to divide the groups alphabetically and create and elected a chair and said, or a facilitator, to say, this is what we want to do. And so I still think that proposal is valid. And I just really wanted to see if there were comments or concerns, and understand the expectations of what those subgroups might do going forward. Anyone? David, I see your hand first.
Chris, if we were to work as subgroups apart from this larger SRC, are there open meeting requirements and public access requirements for those subgroups discussions, and how would that work?
Great question. John, do you want to comment about that legal opinion, and I can also comment?
Yeah, you're right. I'll comment. And I did pose this question to legal at the Anschutz campus. So I guess a couple of things. And the SRC is a committee essentially of the School of Public Health, and not a committee of state government. At least reading things, and the interpretation was that we are required to announce if there are meetings. There's not, at least on reading things, a necessity that if you're holding a working meeting, that it has to be a public open session as we are doing now. I mean, I would see that for many reasons, including maintaining transparency, if there were subgroups, all the final deliberations and outcomes of those discussions would be brought back to the full group and discussed openly. We would, I think, in the spirit of of what we were trying to do, announce that a subgroup meeting might be held. But I think if 4 members were getting together to, say, discuss recommendations or a draft report, that would be announced, but it would not be, an open public session. The findings of that, of course, would be brought back to an open public session.
Yes, and David, that's my interpretation as well. I really wanted us to mix it up a little bit. Obviously, use your expertise wisely to have actually a discussion about the information that we have, because we might have different recommendations, and we could then discuss that in the open meeting and make a decision about which recommendations went forward, not only for the report from the School of Public Health, but our own recommendations. So that was the intent of those 2 discussions. Any other questions or comments?
So, just Chris, one other comment on looking over the bill, just a reminder that the SRC will need, when we get to the public education campaign phase, will need to approve the campaigns that are developed.
Yes, that is correct. And we did mention that a little bit earlier, John, that was an approval process as opposed to providing input and advisory, as Greg had mentioned earlier. So I don't hear a whole lot of disagreement or affirmation of this proposal going forward. So let me put something on the table. I think that we've gotten a lot of good information here, and I would still think that it's valuable for us to divide up into 2 subgroups. One group look at the extraction, the evidence map, with the intention of coming up with some recommendations about future research, the strength of the evidence, or whatever we believe is important to come forward. And it may be that there's insufficient evidence to make recommendations. I would not want to say that now, but I would want to have an honest discussion about that in a smaller group that talks or deliberates that or makes that decision, that we still have more research to do before we make definitive recommendations and our policy changes. So that's one. That's the subgroup 1. The second piece is this gaps analysis. I think this is really where the meat of the discussion really has to happen. We've already discovered many gaps, and we've heard the challenges that the research team has done. So that would be the second group that I would propose. And we get rid of the 3rd and 4th groups. We really just focus at least 1 meeting on some preliminary recommendations, looking really at all the material that we've looked at so far, and do we have information to have recommendations going forward. And the other group being start to address at least the gaps so that we can begin to maybe make some recommendations around gaps that we want to move forward independently as the SRC, as well as input into the School of Public Health's recommendations. That would be my proposal, putting it on the table. Any comments about that proposal?
Chris, I like the way that you stated all this and everything. I don't think that we have enough data in our hands to find gaps yet, because I've already seen things that I thought weren't there. So I don't know what the trigger point would be to say we should have a meeting for subgroup 2.
Okay.
You have a feeling for that?
I think we have, I think the characteristics of the studies, the demographics, we have a lot of information, or actually we have very little information there, so that we can actually make some recommendations there, because there is a paucity of information regarding those bold characteristics that we thought were going to be there but aren't there. So that would be one piece that we could look at. So
okay.
Can I throw one issue in, then Greg, just something to think about, the SRC to think about, would be what would constitute adequate evidence? I think we could talk about the ideal, but that might be a useful point for discussion among the SRC. I mean, if we're to make evidence-based recommendations, given the heterogeneity of the literature, I mean, I think we're certainly getting a feel for that, even with a limited number of studies. Ideally, what would we have? What would a table of good evidence look like? And I think this is probably something for us to think about. And we could sort of put this into the perspective of the guideline world, perhaps, and say, can we get there? I mean, could we find 4 or 5 studies that would allow us to really get a dose response for effects, whether considered beneficial or adverse, for example? Just thought. I mean, it's something we as a team have not grappled with, but I think it's a good question.
Other thoughts from the SRC?
I'd just respond to John and say, throwing out some ideas for adequate evidence, certainly replication would be critically important, seeing from more than one group the same effect, seeing it measured, in different ways or with different methods, observational versus RCT or lab-based. Those things to me would be more convincing.
Yeah, no, thanks. I agree. And some of us, Lisa and I and Tanjing, others live in sort of different worlds where there are different standards for what constitutes adequate evidence, but it might be, and Lisa, probably you in particular should weigh in here in terms of sort of the pharmacological world, what would constitute adequate evidence, because I think we probably should think through if we're going to judge the evidence to be, insufficient, weak, suggestive, whatever, we should probably be able to align that with some characteristics, like consistency, for example, or coherence across different lines of investigation.
Well, and I think it's going to depend on the question. And so, I would say for different types of questions, what's the ideal evidence? Because, we're facing the same thing, in the environmental health area. If you can't do trials, there's really no point in saying that that's the best evidence that you're looking for. It's an unattainable goal. So, for different questions, population-based studies, randomized trials, the laboratory studies that were brought up, I thought that was interesting. There may be different standards.
Other comments or concerns?
Well, process, just so you're proposing that we have 2 subgroups that address roughly 4 questions.
Actually, I'm getting rid of the 3rd and 4th subgroups.
We're getting rid of the 3rd and 4th. You're just 1 and 2.
If we get to having a small group looking at the data and extractions, I think that'd be tremendous before the next meeting. Because I do think, in the interest of being transparent, it'd be useful if we had some discussions and brought that forward to the public to say, we don't have enough information yet. It's preliminary. Our recommendation is the following kind of thing. And the same thing with the GAPS group. The GAPS group would say, this is what we know preliminarily are gaps on the characteristics of the studies, and that we're looking for, as we do further analysis or extraction of data, we're going to identify more gaps as we come forward. So that's my proposal. Now, I have a question for you, Lisa and Tanjing. Are you guys anywhere close to coming up with recommendations at this point, or some sort of gap analysis that you could share with the SRC, or is that going to be in the last 2 weeks before the report is being prepared? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'd like your thoughts about how you guys are going to roll that out.
Well, I mean, and Tanjing, you answered too, but Chris, you raised that kind of the gaps we've identified just through the difficulties with data extraction. So I think, we have identified some problems there that we can talk about already. As far as identifying gaps in the actual studies or the topic areas, I mean, we only get as far as the data extraction there. So,
yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sitting here just thinking about, we have this report due by July 1st. You know, one of the things even from the characteristics of the studies we have collected, you know, one gap that jumped out to me is we don't have a lot of studies who have looked at, you know, sort of the social determinants of health or the health equity issues. So that's something we can definitely say just based on our the data we have extracted. And I think, Rosa, we do have a plan to put all these preliminary data from those 480 some studies into Tableau. So I would encourage the SRC members to, you know, to see the data, to filter out the data in any way you would like to see, because, you know, we don't have the content expertise for every single disease topic area. So there might be something like, for me, I'm interested in how cannabis is affecting any ocular diseases. So if you narrow it down a little bit, it might help you to think about what are the gaps that we can say at this moment in time.
So Tanji, so we have the Tableau dashboard. We'll have the beginning to see the outcome potency, the evidence maps on outcomes preliminarily. So we could start with those, I would assume, right?
Yeah, and I don't know, we can certainly make all the, you know, full text PDFs available to the SRC. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper beyond what data we have already collected, those papers will be there for you. So if you filter out by, you know, what studies have looked at, you know, traditionally disadvantaged population and what those studies are, you will be able to see a little bit more detail of those studies.
Great, thank you. David, thanks for being so patient.
No, I just, I wanted to extend John's question about the threshold for evidence and whether or not, just from a philosophical standpoint, if we would have different standards for negative health outcomes versus some positive health outcome. For instance, just hypothetically, if you had 4 or 5 studies that had individual, and many times these negative health outcomes will be secondary outcomes in these analyses if they're, you know, cases of psychosis, acute psychosis associated with high concentrated THC products, but that wasn't necessarily the primary outcome of the study, which was, you know, as we saw in the studies that were shared with us, covered a variety of different types of health outcomes. So I guess that's one question I would bring up, thinking about safety, whether or not our thresholds would be different for negative consequences of use.
Very good point, David. I think that's kind of where I would hope that in that smaller group discussion, we could bring up those issues, because clearly that would be, when you're talking about outcomes, and I would guess if I was sitting on the legislative council asking the School of Public Health and this SRC to come up with recommendations, they would want to hear what our recommendations are, or the biases, or the gaps, or the discrepancies, or the inability to make a distinction between a health benefit and an adverse outcome. Because I think they want an answer. And if we just say it's not yet available, or that research is not there, this is our systematic review, and this is what we found, that's a very useful discussion and recommendations. Kenan, you had a comment.
I guess I'm just trying to think, if I was in the legislature, the questions that I would have is why should these products exist or be available? So it seems like the questions you need to answer are, number one, do they offer some advantage over lower potency things? And number two, are there different risks, and what are the relative risks over them? And those are really the big questions that it seems like we need to be trying to answer. And then within that, are there differences based on, you know, different background of the people that are being involved, and is it affecting other populations differently? But the first big questions have to be, why should we even have these products available? Are they better? Are they safer? Are they more effective?
I think you hit it on the head, Ken. I think that's the issue. And I think so far we've seen from the data extraction is we can't determine that yet. You know, the heterogeneity of the studies, the heterogeneity of the dosing, and the outcomes is all extremely variable. And to answer that question, we may not have the answer just yet. but good question. Okay, John, you had a comment.
Yeah, I was actually, I was hoping Lisa would jump in response to David, but I will, and then maybe Lisa would. I mean, I think your point is an important one, and it has to do with the level of evidence that might lead to different kinds of action. And so suggestive evidence, let's say, of a very severe adverse outcome might trigger a recommendation that, in fact, if you're precautionary, that, a particular population or a particular product has risks that could be unacceptable, although the evidence is not all in. And on the, looking the other side, conversely, if we're looking for benefit, in terms of action, you might wait for a therapeutic indication to go beyond suggestive. Certainly with suggestive evidence, you wouldn't get a new agent approved by FDA for therapeutic benefits. So there may be some asymmetry here in how recommendations are made or how the legislature responds, i.e. is it being precautionary on the risks? And so there might be some, I'll use the word again, asymmetry of sort of the level of evidence needed to make different sorts of recommendations. And which would make sense to me from sort of a guidelines perspective. But Lisa, do you have thoughts about this? I mean, you live in this world.
Yeah,
too.
well, one thing, I mean, the SRC might want to consider is, and this is done on guidelines committees where people formally say, okay, we don't have the same level of evidence, the same low risk of bias, the same study designs for harm and benefit, but we take these other considerations into account. How big is the population affected? How great is how severe is the harm potentially? What is the population affected? Is this a vulnerable population? So they use evidence to decision tables that actually add these other factors to weighing just the quote risk of bias or quality of the evidence. And I think that's so important when you're looking at harm, because most policymakers, well, not a lot of policymakers do operate on the precautionary principle. So they're much more interested in protecting people from harm based on a lower standard of evidence than they are in putting a new product on the market.
Well, and I hate to bring up another gnarly issue, but we haven't dealt with it at all, and it's impossible to get at in the literature, but we have not talked about tolerance, and that's the real impact. I mean, that is just a huge effect. How long the individual's been using it, have they had to increase their dose over time? Some people wake up with THC levels that would be extraordinarily impairing and people who don't use all the time, and they're just fine, and you can't determine many cognitive or motor deficits in them. And so we haven't even talked about that. So recommendations are really going to be also confounded, certainly in the medical marijuana realm, by end of tolerance and chronicity of use.
Yeah, and I mean, we do have a data point on that, but again, it's so heterogeneous. I'm not even sure looking at these studies if we can put them into buckets. This was a tolerant group of participants or not, because people are actually, as you all tipped us off to long ago, reporting that in very different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think what Paul says is exactly what the response to what Kenan asked is, the products exist because people buy them. And that's probably the argument that we're going to get back if we say that a specific, if we try to make that argument, in one population it's necessary for their therapeutic benefit, in another population it wouldn't be.
So this is the type of discussion I think we haven't ever had, and I think this is the valuable piece of your expertise as the SRC, is to kind of hash through this. What can we say as recommendations, and what can't we say, and what would a safety profile look like? What would a adverse benefit look like, and what's missing? And so I think that's the kind of discussion we've not been able to have, because the research team has worked very hard, but it's a huge amount of work, and we still have this preliminary report due July 1. And I know I sense some anxiety, you said some anxiety in I don't want to do it on June 30th and submit it on July 1st. That just wouldn't work without some sort of discussion in a smaller group fashion. So that's where I'm at with this. So John had your hand up, and then Erica next.
Yeah, so one thing that we should be thinking about, and I guess this is we in the SRC, what kinds of research would be needed? And I mean, I think that's a really tough question. And if, you know, I think it's obvious to all that we're going to find major deficiencies in the existing body of literature as we have assembled it. That is an easy conclusion. And I think we can write that right now, you know, to say that the systematic review returned a very diverse and flawed body of evidence, period. But how do we get the evidence we need? And what kinds of studies would we need to get there? And you know, and what combination of sort of real world observational studies and, you know, various kinds of more rigorous experiments could provide answers. And I think that's something that, you know, we need to start tackling. And Chris might be on sort of the SRC subgroups task list to think about. We'll be thinking about it too, but I can't answer that question sitting here right at the moment. I mean, I think it's not an easy question to answer, and trials are designed for benefit, of course, and not for producing adverse effects. So, you know, I think this question of, you know, what kinds of studies could provide the evidence needed to say that there are concentrations that carry too much risk, how would we get there?
Mhm.
Erica, I saw your hand up come up briefly. And then
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what John had just said. It's like, what is the evidence? You know, what is the evidence? What are we? What is our criteria for saying we identify all these gaps, and we can talk about those through categorizations of where that lack of evidence is, whether it's, you know, insufficient specific definitions of outcomes, or whether it's lack of quantifying measurable exposure or potency, and the inconsistency within in regards to the type of consumption that occurs. But it almost seems like some of the previous conversations or comments that were made just recently were really along the lines of, what does the FDA think about when they're trying to evaluate a substance for eligibility for a therapeutic effect? I mean, I guess that's my question, kind of similar to what John just stated, probably better than I did, just saying, you know, what is the criteria that we're looking for to say what is the evidence that is needed?
I think several of you stated that already. You know, these products exist because people buy them. And I think without a whole lot of evidence, and maybe the question about tolerance is really a good one, people just need more and more. But for the virgin user, the adverse effects may be even greater. And I don't think we've even answered that question yet. So again, this is a good discussion. Paula, and then Tanjin.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to, go back to a process question. So, I mean, I guess the thing on the table is two subgroups answering 1 and 2 versus, I suppose the other alternate process would be, why not address those 2 questions in this group rather than break off in small and then come back together? I mean, what would be more, given the time constraints, what would you hope would come out of small group discussion, knowing they have to also bring their thought process and their discussion essence back to this larger group versus we just tackle it here? Questions 1, 2, 3. I'm just putting it on the table just because I'm thinking about everyone's time and the constraints of time and the timeline of July 1, as you are too. Small group versus just doing it here in the larger group with all the minds. Don't know.
I'm not wedded to the idea. I just felt like this is the first time we've had a really free-form discussion about the general recommendations, what the challenges are. And it took us to this point of looking at the evidence maps, looking at the extractions to get to this point. And that's, so again, whether or not we do it in a small group or in a larger group, it doesn't matter to me.
But I think we're there to have this so that we could probably have a conversation and address it in the larger, rather than try to organize small, you know what I mean? I'm really not wedded to either one, but I think we have the potential to do it in the larger group. We just do it. Plus, I don't know what people think about it, but.
Yeah, I'm open. How do folks think? What do you think about that?
Can I?
Again,
try
no, these are
yeah.
very open meetings. We have to have the discussion in an open meeting if we announce it and talk about it. And I'm completely comfortable sharing my ignorance around THC, high potency marijuana. So,
Chris, a thought here. We will be meeting as a team on Friday, and I think at that point, Lisa and I discussed having a draft sort of outline, and one possibility would be a commitment by the SRC to have a series of regular meetings, and they might sort of be in crescendo fashion, given the deadline here. And we could feed, to give you some very focused thing, feed parts of the report in, and there are parts of the report right now that we could begin writing. And I think, certainly the methodology, the protocol's published, you've seen it, you've reviewed it. Some of the conclusions, I mean, again, remembering that 3 hours per study in a fairly big team, will have a mounting body of evidence to look at around what the literature looks like. And I think there's pieces. So it's up to the SRC how you want to meet and schedule. We'll support you with arranging meetings. I just think we're all going to be pushing to deal with the timetable. But one way to ease the burden on the SRC would be for us to bring pieces to you as they are written.
Obviously, that would necessitate another meeting or two, which would be okay, of the larger SRC. We'd have to post those, and people would have to commit to doing that.
Yeah,
that would be fine.
Well, we do, we could post a series of meetings. I mean, one thing, just as a reminder, we need to give 2 weeks notice for full SRC meetings with posting. So if we want to get a cadence, sort of as Paula suggests, of regular full committee meetings, essentially we should get a series of them posted, perhaps a bunch, recognizing that all SRC members are not going to be able to attend all of them.
Fair enough. Thanks for the proposal. Greg, you had a comment.
Is it reasonable when we post this sequence of meetings to have specific questions that we're going to address at each one so they don't go too freeform?
Yeah.
Sure. That's kind of how we plan our meetings now, Greg. We have a small group meeting, John, Kelsey, I, and members of the research team. We think about what's ready to present, and that's what we present. We could do that in reverse to say, this is what we have. These are the questions or this is a preliminary report, preliminary recommendations, preliminary methodology. We'd like you to react to it, be prepared to discuss it at that next meeting.
Because I think Paula's question is very important. How are we going to address tolerance? How are we going to look for evidence for lack of evidence for tolerance and stuff like that? And then we could use Tableau to each of us do whatever research we want to look at on Tableau, and then bring it to that next meeting.
Yeah, with focused questions, like for the SRC, we just go, boom, we're addressing this one. Do we have consensus? Do we have all the input? Done. Number 2, just get it done.
All right, so let's pull back a little bit. We've had several proposals on the table. I sense that there's not a whole lot of enthusiasm for the subgroups. Completely fine with me. I sense that they were leaning more towards having another meeting or two, a large group meeting with specific either recommendations at times or specific questions that we want answers to, that we'll have to do a little homework prior to getting to the meeting, but we want to discuss that question, which I would hope, turn into a recommendation. And as opposed to just trying to answer a question, but the question leads towards a recommendation, not only for the research group, but for the SRC's report. Is that what I hear?
I'd vote for that.
All right, so I'm not going to restate that proposal, but do people feel comfortable with adding another meeting or two, and then going with that approach, either reacting to some recommendations or reacting to a specific question with some research outside of the meeting? If you're in favor of that, just raise your hand. For those who didn't raise your hand, do you understand what I just said? Anybody opposed to that approach? Okay, so sounds like we're moving that direction. So you'll see this in the minutes. We'll try to put this together. Kelsey and I try to figure out how to summarize this going forward, so that's pretty clear about where our recommendations are. So you'll see that in our minutes. Any last comments? John, you had a comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that we should schedule probably 2 lengthier meetings towards the end of June to get those on the calendar, because at that point, we need to be heading towards a final version of the report. And I think we probably need sort of 2 in sequence so that there could be feedback, revisions, and then so I think we should get something like that on the schedule. So Chris, you and I, Kelsey, can get together and figure out the timing of that.
Does that seem reasonable to folks? Yeah, I see some shaking heads, and I see some bewilderment from the faces there. Maybe because it's getting to 5 o'clock. That's possible. All right. So thanks, everybody. Any last questions or comments from our group? Either the research group or the SRC. Okay, so thank you to Bobby and to Kelsey and the research team for some great presentations and hard work on doing the data extraction. Thank you to all of you, the SRC, for your active discussion and questioning and challenging. I think it's really useful. And thanks to the public for tuning in. Obviously we don't have all the answers yet, but we're committed to try to come up with some recommendations and try to do the best job of what we have in the available literature. So thanks everybody for a great meeting.
Okay, thanks to everyone.